The Positive Theory of Capital by Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk. Book 7. The Rate of Interest. Chapter 2. The Rate in Market Transactions. The character of the market in which present goods are exchanged against future goods has already been described. We now know the people who appear in that market as buyers and sellers. We know that the supply of present goods is represented by the community's current stock of wealth, with certain unimportant exceptions, and that the demand for them comes 1. From the suitors for productive credit who wish to equip themselves for their own work in production, 2. From the suitors for wage-paid labor, and 3. From the suitors for consumption credit. To these three categories we may add, under certain reservations, the maintenance of the landowners. Finally, it will be remembered that the resultant market price must, as a rule, be in favor of present goods, and must lead to an agio on the same. What we have now to do is to group together the causes which determine the height of this agio to one adequate and typical picture. If we were to attempt all at once to draw a picture like this, covering, as it does, the whole area of the varied influences that cross and intersect each other on the market, we should meet with great, indeed insuperable difficulties, in the way of statement. I shall, therefore, act on the principle divide et impera, and first consider how the price is determined under the assumption that, confronting the supply of present goods, there is one single branch of demand, though in present circumstances by far the most important branch, which is the demand of wage earners. Once we have drawn in broad, clear lines the most important and difficult part of the whole picture, it will be relatively easy to define the kind and measure of the share which all the remaining market factors have in forming the resultant, and so gradually to make the picture true to the full complexity of practical life. For good reasons I also retain provisionally the former assumption that the whole supply and the whole demand for present goods meet in one single market embracing the entire community. And finally, we shall suppose, meanwhile, that all branches of production show the same productiveness, and also the same increment of productiveness on each extension of the production period. That is to say, we shall assume an identical scale of surplus returns. Suppose then that in our community the stock of wealth in the market, as supply, amounts to £1,500,000,000, and that there are 10,000,000 of wage earners. The annual product of each worker increases in all branches of production, in proportion to the length of the production period, from £35 in a 1 year's process to £70 in a 10 years' process. The question is, in these circumstances of the market, how high will rise the agio on present goods? It is quite certain, as we have already explained, that the agio will settle at that level where supply and demand exactly balance each other, and this lies between the subjective valuations of the last pair who actually exchange. But the fixing of these valuations here encounters a quite exceptional difficulty, and one which does not occur in any other exchange transaction, but has its basis in a special peculiarity of the commodity labor. Every other commodity, that is to say, has a predetermined subjective value to the one who wishes to buy it. Labor has not, and for this reason. It is valued according to its prospective product, while the prospective product varies according as that labor is invested in a short or in a long production process. We said above that in the subjective circumstances of the capitalist, a sum of present goods was, as a rule, worth as much as the same sum of future goods. The capitalist will, therefore, count the value of labor equal to just as many present shillings as it will bring him in the future, but according as this labor is invested in a short or roundabout process, it may bring him in £35 or £58 or £70, at which these figures is the capitalist to value it. It may be answered, according to the product aimed at it entering upon the method of production which is economically the most reasonable. He will therefore value the year's labor at £35, if, on reasonable grounds, he meditates adopting a 1 year's process; at £70, if he considers a 10 years' period the most suitable. This would be very well if only it was certain beforehand what period was the most suitable for the undertaker. But this is not certain; on the contrary, the length of the process is itself dependent on the rate of wage fixed as a resultant price, on the labour market. If the wage, for instance, stands at £25, a 1 year's process is the most favourable for the undertaker. At £25 he gains £10 in the year, or, to put it exactly, in the 6 months, since on the average the advance extends over only 6 months, that is 80% per annum. In a 10 years process for the £25 in wages he gets £70, and the surplus return of £45 is absolutely much greater. But when divided as profit over an average of 5 years, gives only £9 for 1 year, or a profit of 36%. On the other hand, if the year's wage is £50, it is quite clear that it would be as much absurd to choose a 1 year's process with its product of £35 as it is most reasonable in the previous circumstances, and only those longer production periods which show an annual product of over £50 could be thought of. The matter, therefore, stands as follows. Elsewhere in the case of other commodities, the employment for which the buyers wish to acquire them is already determined. It is the fixed point, the thing which first of all helps determine the price offered by the buyers, and then through that the resultant market price. Here, in the case of commodity labor, on the contrary, the employment is an undetermined amount, an x, which is first determined by the resultant price. In these circumstances it is clear that the fixed point of the price transactions must be got somewhat differently from the ordinary way, not, of course, according to different principles or laws, but with a certain casuistical modification in detail which we now have to examine. In place of the fixed point, which is not available because the employment of the labor itself is not fixed, we find a substitute in the fact that another amount, usually indeterminate, is here fixed, which is the quantity sold. It may be taken as certain that all the labor offered, like the whole sum of present goods offered, finds a market. The certainty of this is based on a peculiar circumstance. Exactly as in the science of money, it is a familiar dogma that in the long run any sum of money, be it great or small, is sufficient to do the work of circulation in a community, so is it true that any sum of present goods, be it great or small, is sufficient to buy up the whole supply of wage labor that exists in the community, and to pay its wages. All that requires to be done is to contract or extend the production period. If there are 10,000,000 wage workers and 1,500 millions of capital, this stock is just sufficient to pay the 10,000,000 workers £30 a year each over a 10 years production process. If there are only 500 millions of capital, no laborers need go idle on that account. Only, of course, they cannot have their maintenance advanced them for a 10 years process, but at the same wages of £30 only for a 3 years process, and the average duration of the production period must be curtailed accordingly. Suppose there are only 50 millions of capital, all the labor could still be bought, but now for only 4 months' process, and it must be secured by a further shortening of the production period, that the scanty amount of present goods is renewed after every short period by the accession of fresh returns. It is, therefore, always possible for the existing stock of wealth to buy all the labor, and there are certain reasons in this case that work very strongly towards always making the possible into the actual. Between capitalists and laborers, the economic conditions are, with very few exceptions, extremely favorable to the effecting of exchange. The laborers urgently need present goods, and cannot or can scarcely turn their own labor to any account. They will, therefore, to a man rather sell their labor cheaply than not sell it at all. But very much the same is true of the capitalists. In their peculiar circumstances of want and provision for want, their present goods, which they, in any case, would lay up against the future, are not worth more to them than a similar sum of future goods. They will, therefore, prefer any purchase of labor where there is an agio, however little it may be, rather than let their capital lie dead. And the consequence is that all capital, like all labor, actually comes to a sale. As a fact we see that, in all economic communities, although the quantitative relations between wealth and number of wage earners are extremely various, these two amounts exactly buy up each other. There are everywhere a few laborers who have no work, and a few capitals which are not employed. But this is, of course, not in contradiction to what has been said. I need scarcely point out that the presence of such unemployed is never traceable to the purchasing power of capital being insufficient to the whole number of the laborers in a poorer country. Indeed, a capital of half the amount would have to pay the same number of laborers, and actually does pay them, but always to certain frictional and temporary disturbances of organization, such as are inevitable in a mechanism of so complicated as the industrial division of labor in a great country. We may, therefore, assume it as certain that the whole supply of labor and the whole supply of present goods comes to mutual exchange. In this fact the length of the production period, and thus the amount of product which the undertaker may obtain through the labor he buys, obtains a certain definiteness. That is to say, we must in any case assume such a period of production that, during its continuance, the entire disposable fund of subsistence is required for, and is sufficient to pay for, the entire quantity of labor offering itself. If the period were to be shorter than this, some capital would remain unemployed; if longer, all the workers could not be provided for over the whole period. The result would always be a supply of unemployed economic elements urgently offering their services, and this could not fail to upset the offending arrangements. But we are not yet finished with the subject. It is not one single definite production period that harmonizes with the above assumption, but a great many different periods. Obviously, given the capital and the number of workers, a very varying number of years can be provided for according as the wage of labor is high or low. With a capital of 1,500 millions, for instance, our 10,000,000 workers can be kept in work and wage for 10 years at a wage of £30, or for 5 years at a wage of £60, or for 6 years at a wage of £50. Now which of these possible cases will be the one actually adopted? This will be determined by the play of the same egoistic motives as regulate the formation of price in competition generally, in the following way. Assume for a moment that the usual wage is £30. A capitalist then with £1,000, for convenience sake, we shall take this amount as the unit throughout the following discussion, may employ either 66.6 laborers in 1 year's process, or 33.3 laborers in a 2 years' process, or 22.2 in a 3 years' process. Naturally, he will choose the process which he finds most advantageous, which process that is will be seen from the following table, showing how many workers can be employed by £1,000 in each production period, and how much annual profit may be got from that sum. The table shows that in the given circumstances of all the factors, it is most profitable for the undertakers to devote themselves to a 3 years' production period. They obtain thereby the very considerable rate of 51.1%, while both in the longer and in the shorter processes the profit is lower. In these circumstances naturally all undertakers will seek to adopt this length of process. But to what does this lead? In a 3 years' process £1,000 can employ 22.2 workers, and therefore to employ all the available capital in the community, which is 1,500,000,000, 33 1/3 million workers would be needed. While there are only 10 millions, these 10,000,000 workers could be employed by a sum of £4.5 million, leaving capital to the amount of 10.5 million lying idle. Of course these 10.5 millions of capital would not and would not remain so. They would compete for employment, attract laborers by offering higher wages, and the necessary result would be a rise in the rate of wages. The £30 rate, then, assuming the above position of the factors, cannot possibly be a permanent one. Suppose now that the rate of wages is £60. We get the following table. This table proves that if we assume £60 as the rate of wages, production in anything less than a 5 years' period shows a positive loss, while, of the longer periods, the 8 years' process is the most profitable. It yields the modest interest of 3.54%, but relatively speaking, it is the most favorable rate that can be got. It is easy to see, however, that it is as impossible for a wage of £60 as it was for £30 to be the definite resultant price of labor. Under the assumed circumstances of productivity, the 8 years' period is the most profitable length of process at a £60 rate of wage, by adopting a capital of £1,000, can employ only 4.16 laborers. Consequently, the entire capital of 1,500,000,000 can employ only 6.25 million workers, and the remaining 3.75 millions must starve. This again is impossible. The unemployment will offer their services in competition with each other, and the wages will be pressed below the rate of £60. At what point, then, will this overbidding and underbidding, which come from unemployed capital when wage is too low, and from unemployed labor when wage is too high, come to an end? Obviously it will be when the most reasonable production period exactly absorbs the wage fund on the one side and the labor offered on the other. This will be the case, as the following table shows, at a wage of £50. At a wage of £50 the 6 years production period proves the most profitable. It gives an interest of 10% on the invested capital, while a 5 years process would return only 9.6%, and a 7 years 9.7%. Moreover, as at that wage the £1,000 employs 6 2/3 laborers, the entire 10 million workers and the entire 1,500 millions of capital find employment, and the point is reached where the formation of price may come to rest. All who have it in their power to disturb the settlement by further over or underbidding have no inducement to do so, and all who might have an inducement have not the power, as on economic grounds they are already excluded from competition. There is no idle capital which might be tempted to seek employment by overbidding, and there are no idle laborers who might be tempted to seek employment by underbidding. And finally, the undertakers who have replaced their production on the footing which makes this favorable position of things possible are rewarded by this arrangement being at the same time the most profitable for them, and they too have no inducement to make any change. Those undertakers, on the other hand, who might have wished to engage in longer or shorter processes, and would thus have made either capital or labor insufficient, are excluded from any such disturbing competition by the fact that such methods of production show either a loss or a smaller profit. The price of labor, then, will and must settle at a wage of £50, and this involves at the same time an agio of 10% on present goods. I say it must do so, for so long as this point is not reached there are certain tendencies always at work to force the price towards it. If, for example, the wage were only a little higher, say £51, the 6 years process would still be the most profitable, but only 9,800,000 laborers could be employed by the available capital of 1,500,000,000. The unemployed, by the urgency of their circumstances, would exert a pressure on the price of labor till such time as they could be taken in, which would be the case when wage came down to £50. If, on the contrary, the wage were a little lower, say £49, the employment of the 10 million workers would take up only £1,470,000,000 of capital. The unemployed remainder would attract employment through overbidding, and the result again would be a rise of wage till such time as the point was reached at which equilibrium all round could take place. If the assumed state of the factors, an agio of 10%, is therefore the economically necessary result, why exactly 10%? The considerations hitherto presented can only answer negatively that the necessary equilibrium could have been reached at no other rate of interest. But we may now inquire whether our figures do not bring out some other circumstances which may positively indicate a rate of 10%, and give us matter for a precise positive law of the interest rate. To arrive at a position of equilibrium, the capital of the community had to be taken out of shorter processes, where full employment could not be found for the existing stock of labor, and employed in gradually extending methods till all the laborers were fully occupied. This was arrived at in the 6 years process. On the other hand, the adoption of still longer processes, for which again the capital is not sufficient, had economically to be prevented. In these circumstances the 6 years producers are the last buyers, the marginal buyers. The would-be 7 years producers are the most capable excluded suitors for means of subsistence, and, according to our well-known law, the price that results must fall between the subjective valuations of these two. How does it stand with these valuations? What we have to look to simply is what is the utility which, for those two sets of buyers, depends on the disposal over a definite sum of means of subsistence. Here, first of all, it may be put down generally that on the disposal over each half-year's wage, in the present case £25, depends 1 year's extension of the production period per worker. Accordingly, with respect to the 6 years' producers, it specially depends on their possession or non-possession of the £25, whether, as regards one laborer, they can embark on or continue in the 6 years' process instead of the shorter 5 years' process. But according to our scheme of productivity, the year's return of one worker in a 5 years' process amounts to only £62, while in a 6 years' process it amounts to £65. What, therefore, as regards the marginal buyer, depends on his having the disposal over £25, is the obtaining of a yearly surplus product of £3. On the other hand, those would-be producers who are trying to take the means of subsistence out of the market in order to extend the production period to a seventh year could gain by their extension only a surplus return of £2. For them, therefore, all that depends on their disposal over the £25 is a surplus of £2, and they are excluded from competition inasmuch as the resultant price has established an agio which exceeds the rate of 2 on 25, which is 8%. If, therefore, and this is indispensable to equilibrium being reached, the extension of the production period is to halt at the limit of 6 years, the agio established by the fixing of the price must lie between the rate that represents the valuation of the last buyer, £3 on £25 or 12% as upper limit, and the rate representing the valuation of the competitors first excluded 8% as lower limit. And thus our former empirical and circumstantial demonstration of the rate of wage and the rate of interest at which equilibrium may be reached on the market must point provisionally to the rate of 10%. It must at least point to the zone between 8% and 12%. The fact within this zone the rate of 10% is exactly brought out is due, of course, not to the limitations indicated by the valuations of the marginal pair, but simply to the quantitative effect of supply and demand. We shall see immediately, however, that the wide latitude 8% to 12% which our abstract scheme leaves for the narrowing action of supply and demand looks considerable only on account of figures accidentally chosen. In practical life the latitude given is almost always vanishingly small. Meanwhile we may put the results at which we have arrived in general form as follows. The rate of interest on the assumptions already made is limited and determined by the productiveness of the last extension of process economically permissible, and of the further extension economically not permissible, in this way that the unit of capital which makes this extension of process possible must always bear an amount of interest less than the surplus return of the first named, and more than the surplus return of the last named extension. Within these marginal limits the price may be more exactly determined by the quantitative relation between wage fund and number of workers, according to the law of supply and demand. In practical life, however, the latter method of determining price is seldom taken. It is true that in our abstract scheme there was an unusually wide latitude to come and go on, because we had assumed a sudden decrease of the surplus return from £3 to £2, that is, a fall of fully one half. But in practical life sudden differences like this scarcely ever occur. The figures which represent the productiveness of the last permissible and the first non-permissible extension come usually very close to each other, and consequently they are sufficient to limit the variations of the interest rates so strictly and sharply that the theoretically more exact determination by means of the relation of supply and demand is practically unimportant. Indeed, assuming that these two marginal limits are very near each other, one of them may even be left out of account without any serious inaccuracy, and the law be simply formulated thus: the rate is determined by the surplus return of the last permissible extension of production. This coincides almost to a word with Thunen's celebrated law, which makes the rate of interest depend on the productiveness of the last applied dose of capital.